You're listening to the Just Japan podcast. Everything you want to know about Japan.
Well, hey there, folks, and welcome to another episode of the Just Japan podcast. My name is Kevin O'Shea. I'm your host of this podcast about all things Japan. And this week, another fantastic conversation, a new topic, a first-time guest. I had the pleasure of having a conversation with Mr. Douglas Brooks. And Douglas Brooks is an American boat builder, a master boat builder in America who has been spending the past 30 years apprenticing in Japan, learning about building boats in Japan, visiting Japan, working with master boat builders in Japan, Japanese masters, and learning from them to maintain traditions that are dying off. One of the things that we see, not just in Japan, but around the world, with shifting demographics and populations shrinking in different countries, is often we see traditions disappear as the artisans who maintain those traditions, who create those crafts, who build those crafts, as they pass on. Oftentimes, we're seeing that they don't have apprentices and there aren't people taking over those traditions. So again, Douglas has this fantastic history himself, a story of building boats in America and then coming to Japan and falling in love with Japanese boats and then learning from Japanese boat builders. So that's our conversation, and you guys are really going to enjoy it. So sit back and listen to my conversation with boat builder Douglas Brooks. We are here with another episode of the Just Japan podcast, and I am joined today by Douglas Brooks, who is based in the United States. Douglas, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, so, in the introduction to the podcast, I often talk a little bit about what the topic will be, and people can, of course, see from the title. But I was wondering if you could introduce yourself to the listeners and tell everyone a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Okay, thank you. So I'm a boat builder, writer, researcher, and teacher. And for over 30 years, I've been studying traditional Japanese boat building. So my work really throughout, a 40-plus year career has been a focus on traditional wooden boats, right from the start. And right from the start, I was actually doing boat building in a museum setting. So early on, I got comfortable with curating boat collections and doing research on boat building and boat builders. And about 10 years in, came the opportunity to go to Japan. And when I did, I was, not unsurprisingly, drawn to look at traditional boats in Japan. But it was a big surprise for me because what I found, what I left in America, North America, Europe, and elsewhere is what we call a revival in traditional wooden boat building. And what I found in Japan was the exact opposite of that.
Oh, okay.
All the boat builders I met were elderly, and even more crucially, almost none of them had taught apprentices. And that is how the craft had always been sustained through the master-apprentice relationship. And yet that had been cut off. Okay. So, so I was struck by that, and now it's years later and 9 apprenticeships later.
Wow. So I'm curious, like as we backtrack, a couple of things I want to touch on. First of all, I'm curious. No problem. No. I'm curious. First of all, I'm someone who. I don't know, like later on, as I get older in life, I'm kind of saying to myself, I kick myself and think, I wish I had gotten into some kind of more hands-on type of work. I think a lot of people who maybe work careers where they're not doing that kind of thing. I mean, I'm a primary school teacher. I'm wondering, like, first of all, how did you find yourself getting, as a young man, becoming a boat builder? I grew up in a fishing community, and I saw I didn't see boat building. That wasn't something that was happening in my community. But I often saw that it was often a family business. You know, if you were going to be into fishing or you're going to be into making a living off the sea. So how did you get into boat building? And I'm curious then about this revival that you had mentioned in North America, Europe with boat building. Yeah, if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I grew up in a small town in Connecticut, USA, and my father was a house carpenter, so I grew up surrounded by tools and was getting involved in woodworking in a very rudimentary way. Went off to college, studied philosophy, but I did a semester undergraduate program in American Maritime Studies at Mystic Seaport Museum, which is North America's largest maritime museum and perhaps qualifies as the largest maritime museum in the world. I'm not sure. But as part of that program, I got an opportunity to build a small traditional boat with the museum's boat builder. And it was not an apprenticeship, but it was a taste of boat building. And I was really pretty moved by that. And post college, I moved to the San Francisco Bay Area. I worked in construction. I was a bricklayer, worked as a carpenter, worked in a very famous West Coast boatyard, and eventually got a job at the Maritime Museum in San Francisco. And it was just when that museum was creating a small boat shop. And I kind of talked my way in and became assistant to the boat builder in the boat shop. And that's where I think, got hooked by traditional boat building and working with historic boats.
Okay. Wow, that's fascinating. And then when you arrived in Japan, so did you come to Japan, more than 30 years ago with the intention of learning about boat building, or was it accidental? Or was that the intent of coming to Japan?
Well, no, I didn't come with that intention. But on another college program, my junior year, I attended the University of Oregon. My roommate was from Hiroshima, and we became very good friends. And after graduation, he began inviting me to his native country, and I kept turning him down. And finally, in 1990, I wrote him a letter. And I just let him know that I had just left my job at the Maritime Museum in San Francisco and kind of wasn't sure what I was doing next. And 2 weeks later, I got an envelope from him, and it had a plane ticket and a note that said, "Now you have no excuses."
Nice.
So in 1990, I had a rail pass and a youth hostel membership card. And a free ticket to Japan. And I did a lot of the typical tourist things, and kind of halfway through my trip sort of realized, I don't need to see another castle, temple, or shrine, and made a very conscious decision and said, the one thing I never get tired of looking at is wooden boats. And so I just set off along the coastline. And I started to meet boat builders and see boats. And that's where that story started to fall into place from the craftspeople I met, that they were all elderly and none had apprentices. And on that first trip, I actually met the man who would become my first teacher on Sado Island.
So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that then. Like, how did that happen? How did you connect with I read an article that you had sent to me where you had approached a master about learning and you were turned down, and then later the master approached you.
Yes.
So how did you make that first connection with a boat building master? Especially it's a foreigner.
Actually, I went to Sado Island solely because of a magazine photo. I saw a photograph of a tubboat, and many of your listeners might not know what these are, but if any are young enough and interested in anime, the tubboat features prominently in the movie Spirited Away. And it is literally a barrel that floats on the sea, and were traditionally used by women for gathering shellfish and seaweed things like that. But anyway, I had this magazine photo and just decided, well, where's Sado Island? I'll go there. And I had no expectation I would find these boats. And there were a couple hundred of them. And in 1990, they were still, actively being used. And I was introduced on that first trip to one of two builders. There were two craftspeople still building tugboats. And I was so completely blown away by this that I came back to the United States, saved up my money, and 2 years later, I went back to Japan, hired an interpreter in Tokyo, and went out to Sado Island.
Oh, wow.
And by that time, one of those craftspeople had passed away.
Oh, okay.
And so there was only one professional builder of tugboats left. And my interpreter and I spent 3 days with him trying to interview him. And my goal was to try to document his work because he had told me, I have no drawings, I work from memory, and I've never had an apprentice. And I mean, to me, it was obvious where this was headed, which was without him, the craft would be lost.
Yeah.
And so went through that 3 days of interviews, left, and came back 2 years later in 1994, again, brought the interpreter with me and tried to do it again. And it really became clear to me on that third trip that it was impossible to try to document his work through an interview process. Yeah. And what I realized and what I confessed to my interpreter was, the only way to do this is to become his apprentice. And I told her, I said, I'd like you to ask him if he would take me on as his apprentice. And she responded by saying that was absolutely unthinkable. I was a foreigner. I didn't speak any Japanese. It wasn't my place to ask him. It was just completely out of the realm, at least of her imagination. And so I decided to trust her, and I didn't say anything. And we said goodbye to Mr. Fuji, and we were actually booked to leave on the 6 a.m. ferry the next morning. And at midnight, he came to our guest house and woke everybody up.
Okay.
And we all piled into the kitchen wanting to know, what had happened, what was wrong. And we found he and his wife in the kitchen, and he was literally shaking like a leaf. And we sat down across from him, and he looked at my interpreter and he said something, and my interpreter gasped. And I looked at her and said, "What did he say?" And she turned to me and said, "He wants you to be his apprentice."
Wow.
And that was
your jaw must have hit the
yes
yeah.
to come out of my mouth. So it took me 2 years. I had to go home. I needed to save up money. And in 1996, I came back, and he and I built a tugboat together. And that is the pattern, and so what I did was I wrote down all the dimensions. I wrote down all the secrets.
Okay.
I described and photographed and videotaped all the techniques. I eventually composed and published the first measured drawings of a tugboat that have ever been published. And my first book is essentially a how-to on how to build the Japanese tugboat. And it's, actually, I never saw my teacher again. In 1999, he died in an accident. And luckily, a foundation on the island came forward and said, we've lost this last craftsperson, and you were his only apprentice. What do we do? And so I said, well, you need to bring me back and train an apprentice, and then you need to publish my research. And I look at that as we did the traditional thing, and I trained an apprentice, and for Japan, we did the non-traditional thing, and tried to put it all in the pages of a book. And it's interesting, with the publication of that first book, it's in English and Japanese, and it was published in Japan.
Yeah.
It got a lot of interesting reaction in Japan because it was a very rare thing.
That was the tugboats of Sado Island, right?
Yes, the Tugboats of Sado Island, a Japanese craftsman's methods. It was a very rare thing because in the West we take this completely for granted, the idea of a how-to book.
Yeah.
How-to videos, how-to DVDs.
Oh yeah.
But in Japan, craftspeople don't produce that kind of thing. And so actually an odd offshoot of that first book is I'm actually very well known among Japan's barrel makers.
Okay.
Because my book is still, as far as I know, the only detailed account of how to do traditional Japanese barrel making. So
that's
I'm actually
amazing.
I'm actually trying to raise funding right now to go back next January and attend what's called the Kyoke Summit in Kagawa Prefecture, which is the Wooden Barrel Summit. And it's an attempt to train a new generation of barrel makers. And it's kind of a hybrid Japanese Western model. It's really, really interesting. And I'd really, really like to go there and talk to people. So
yeah. Oh gosh, so many places I want to go with this right now. One thing that popped into my mind, like as far as the kind of, I think when I lived in Japan for about 10 years. And so those listening know that I was based in Kobe the entire time. So I'm an international school teacher. So, essentially I'm teaching here where I'm based now, I'm in Malaysia, but I'm teaching non-Malaysian children whose parents are here because they work for Intel, they work for consulates, this kind of thing. But in Japan, I worked in Kobe. I taught at an international school that was, predominantly, it was all Japanese kids, but it was in Nadaku, which is the sake making district of Kobe. And so our campus was literally surrounded by sake breweries. And sometimes I tell you at recess, it had an interesting smell in the air, quite lovely. But I would cycle commute every day to school, and every day I would cycle past a sake brewery, and I'll show you a picture up. Here's a photo I took, and this is terrible podcasting. Everyone, audio podcasting. I'm showing Douglas a photo of barrels. Every day I would cycle past. There was a lot of the sake breweries have like a kind of a museum / gift shop, and across the road there was this giant kind of barn. It was along the road, and there was a barrel maker, and he would be in there every day. When I would go to work in the morning, and he had this like big Mercedes G-Wagon parked outside, filled with wood and supplies, and he would have like old barrels tied to the roof of the G-Wagon, this like really expensive vehicle. Wow. And I would see this guy, and he'd be in there like every day working, and I would kind of slow down, and I would like watch kind of go by, and I'd be like, wow. And then every day I would go by, and in my mind, this is like I would be like, I wonder how people learn how to do this. How would I be able to learn how to do this? I wonder. And like I always wanted, like in my mind, for 2 years I would cycle past this guy making barrels. I'd be like, I wonder if I could ask him if I could ever help him, or if I could. And I never did, never got the gumption to do. But that was always going through my mind. That was just that came to my mind because, as you mentioned, barrels and barrel making. So you had mentioned that in you were coming when you first came from North America. Again, there was this kind of revival. But one thing we hear a lot about in Japan these days, often, especially with like the depopulation of the country. I mean, with the shrinking population, and then the depopulation of the rural areas. There's, I think, a lot of arts are being lost. A lot of traditions are being lost. And obviously, this is a crisis for those who care about traditions and care about history. So what is it that, I mean, you had mentioned like with your book, you were, it was such a very North American thing, a very Western thing to have a book, a how-to book, but that's so uncommon. So I'm wondering, I've seen you speak, well, on YouTube, with your recent talk at the Sainsbury Institute, about the Japanese, kind of system of teaching how to build things, and how is that so different, than say in North America? Like, if I wanted to learn how to build boats from you as an American boat builder, it's going to be a very different experience than if I'm in Japan trying to learn how to build boats.
Right. Well, that's a good question. It's a big question. I think the best succinct answer would be in the West, and I think particularly in North America, when it comes to learning, we're obsessed with efficiency.
Yeah.
So if you approach me and said, I want to learn boat building, my first thought would be, well, how do I structure that so that you learn as much information as quickly as possible?
Okay, we've got that whole time is money kind of attitude frame of thinking.
Well, not just time is money, like, because apprenticeship, I think America, I think apprenticeship died here before practically any place else. And what I like to remind people is, the Industrial Revolution modernized and industrialized manufacturing, but we also industrialized education, right? Even vocational education. Vocational education came out of the little workshop, the master and his apprentices, and went into the vocational school. Right?
Yeah, true.
The big institution that could create as many craftspeople, create craftspeople and mass produce them, literally.
Yeah.
In Japan, what I like to say is Japanese apprentice pedagogy. So the West is obsessed with efficiency.
Yeah.
How do I teach you as much stuff in as little time as possible? And the first thing you'll notice about the Japanese apprenticeship is there's no efficiency. Okay. The average boat building apprenticeship in Japan was 6 years.
Oh, okay.
I've talked to boat builders who told me their apprenticeships were 10 years. 6 years is a very common, barrel makers would tell you that, house carpenters would tell you that, roof tilers would tell you that. I'd say 4 to 6 years would be kind of a very standard apprenticeship model. It is instead a values-based education. In other words, in the Japanese context, if you approach me and say, I want to learn how to be a boat builder.
Yeah.
My thought is, are you ready? Do you have what it takes? And I'm going to find that out. And this is exactly what all 9 of my teachers in Japan did to me. The first thing I'm going to do is hand you the broom. And, if you're still here in 3 weeks, well, maybe I've got something to work with.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
because, so what the apprentice has to demonstrate is powers of observation, perseverance, humility, the powers of attention, and obedience. And you could name other values, and those are values.
Yeah.
And it's not until, in the Japanese context, it's not until the apprentice has inculcated those values that there's really any reason, there's really any value in teaching them. So, so in my own situation, I do have to define it. I was with all my teachers for the time it took us to build one boat together. And that ranged from 2 weeks in the case of the tugboat to 7 months in the case of me and my Tokyo teacher. He and I actually built 2 boats together.
Okay.
So most of my apprenticeships have been 2 to 3 months. Okay. Now, the difference is I came into the workshop as an experienced boat builder, though my Japanese teachers really gave me the credit for that. But they were wrong about that. I knew how to use the tools. I knew the techniques were sort of shared across cultures. But nevertheless, there were 2 things that happened, in every one of those situations. Number 1, I was handed the broom. And number 2, I was told that there'd be no talking. So in fact, there is no direct instruction. And this is a really important element of Japanese craft pedagogy. The teacher does not teach. And as I like to say to my college students, because I've developed a university class based on my work, I refuse to teach, but you are required to learn. And I tell them that on the first day. Now, that sounds like a paradox. But again, in the Japanese tradition, you are expected to learn through observation. And I would argue that though it's not efficient, that the quality of that learning is extraordinary because it puts all of the pressure and all of the responsibility on the apprentice. You as a teacher and me as a teacher in North America or the West, we are looked upon by our students as their saviors.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
If they're stuck, we will save them.
Yeah.
And
they look at you for help. They've got the doe-eyed look when they don't know how to do something, whether they're 7 years old or they're 21 years old. They look at you like, help me.
You will, yes. They expect to be rescued.
Yeah.
And in Japan, no.
Sink or swim. Pardon the pun.
And again, I can't overemphasize what a crucible that is to be in, and how you must learn this, and there is no failure. So and I could tell you many stories from my own personal experience, where I was confronted with that, sink or swim. So it is a very powerful learning style. It is not efficient. Sadly, one could argue that Japanese apprenticeship kind of sowed the seeds for its own destruction, because all of my teachers were in their 70s and 80s when I studied with them.
Yeah.
They all came of age at the end of World War II, when the country was completely destroyed. They had no option but to go into, the workshops of their fathers or their neighbors. Yet by the time their children came of age, Japan was rebuilt. It was the world's second largest economy. And in many cases, they were telling their children, leave the village, go to Tokyo, work for Panasonic, get out of here.
Yeah.
And basically that last generation of craftspeople had no apprentices. And also, I think in part because by 1980, let's say, where a young Japanese person had the opportunity to go to university or, move to a metropolitan center, get a different kind of job, who was going to sign up for a 6-year apprenticeship? Largely unpaid.
Yeah.
Like the world had passed that by. And and that's
interesting. I heard recently, not that recently, maybe about a year ago, I was watching a story about wasabi farming in Japan. And wasabi farmers are finding there's like a crisis with wasabi, and it's the same situation where even with farming, there's basically like an apprenticeship that's required. And they were talking about how the number of actual wasabi farms are just, they're just disappearing. And there are younger people, and there is a little bit of a movement now in Japan of younger people who are wanting to leave Tokyo, wanting to leave Osaka, wanting to leave the big cities, leave the tie behind, leave the salaryman job behind, and kind of get back to earth and that kind of thing. But and there was an interest of people who want to get into wasabi farming, but there's like this association that you have to be a member of in order to be able to sell your wasabi. And in order to get into that association, you have to apprentice for like 5 years, and these are often not like super low paying or no pay. And people are saying, well, I have. And in like a situation like me, for example, I mean, if I wanted to do something like that, well, I've got 2 children and a wife I need to support. How can I kind of give up everything when I have this family? Is there a more so it's that kind of idea of that whole type of farming? It's almost shooting itself in the foot in a way, because they're not being flexible and learning that the time has changed, and if there are people who are willing to get into this, but we need to adapt.
Correct.
I mean,
one of the things that to try to paint the picture of craft in Japan, when I lecture, I often like to point out that I live in Vermont, population of 650,000 people.
Yeah.
There are more woodworking schools in Vermont than in Japan. I mean, essentially a parity, let's say.
Yeah.
So when you look at the woodworking schools in Japan, they're all very young. Some of them are, but there are more and more of them. Like right now, I know of yet another one opening up near Mount Fuji. And so Japan is having to make that transition of, how do we carry on these crafts in a way that is open to not just 14-year-old kids from the village, but a wide range of people. And I personally, for myself, I now, think a lot about what can I do to further the preservation of Japanese boat building. And I can't help but think that what Japan needs is what happened in Europe and North America and Australia and New Zealand, which is Japan needs a boat building school.
That's what I was wondering about. I'm wondering like that next step. So like what that's one of the talking points I sent you. I mean, we're leading into that, but what can happen next to ensure that these traditions continue? Because So do you think that would be something that could happen, a boat building school?
I mean, I think it could be. I think it could happen. I think, from my point of view, the obstacles would be, I think it's very difficult to raise funding in Japan.
Okay.
There isn't a tradition of private philanthropy. The money, the support tends to be controlled at, very high centralized levels of government.
Okay.
I think if I opened a boat building school, I might find myself with mostly foreigners. But that would be okay. That would be okay with me.
Yeah.
I've been teaching Japanese boat building. I've now taught in 3 different countries outside of Japan, filled my classes every time, Australia, France, and the United States. So, I think it's doable. I even think that there's a very healthy market for traditional wooden boats because there are so many boats in Japan used in festivals, by shrines. There's more and more, there are new tour boats and that kind of tour business being created that are potentially markets for traditional wooden boats. I just finished a huge project in Japan. I built 6 new 36-foot wooden river boats for the Kumagawa Kudari in Kumamoto. That's a downriver tour boat company. And they had lost their boat builder. The new owner of the company was committed to replacing the fleet with traditional wooden boats, and I built them.
Wow.
And actually, while I was building those boats from the fall of 2022 through the fall of 2023, I was Instagramming or posting on Instagram about it. And I was getting emails from all over the world. Yeah. People saying, I will fly to Japan and I will volunteer with you so that I can learn Japanese boat building.
Wow.
So anyway, and I also got a lot of emails from within Japan, and actually a number of Japanese, I invited them to come visit, spend a few days, volunteer with me, and get exposure. So yeah, there's interest from within the country and from outside the country. But I think it would take that kind of school setting to really make a dent in, trying to save the craft. And I mean, the other piece of it for me is I have 30 plus years of research. I've got 5 books to date, and I know one thing I need to do is keep publishing.
Yeah.
Keep publishing books and drawings, and I'd like to start a YouTube channel where I can show techniques. I've already done some of that. But again, all those things, unfortunately, publishing costs money too.
Yeah.
And the world of publishing is not easy especially when you're writing about a niche subject like this. So, now I'm all depressed. Why did you ask that question?
I'm so sorry. There is hope. There is hope. I think one of the things that I hear about, like, I'll try to undepress you, make you happy here. I'm sorry, but when I hear about that enthusiasm that so many people have, they're reaching out to you saying, I want to do this. And I think that's one of the things that I'm, I don't know, maybe, and I think maybe when we kind of look at the silver linings of the pandemic, I think a lot of people during the pandemic, realized that when they were forced to leave the office and they were forced to be at home, a lot of people found new crafts, and a lot of
Yeah.
people, and I mean, I'm a teacher. God, how many people left that profession? I mean, it's insane how many people left teaching. I mean,
Mm.
by the droves, people left teaching and they went into other careers. And people are like, what can I do? What can I do next? But I think a lot of people have realized that, the kind of a slower kind of life where they're working with their hands and they're kind of making a different type of connection. Um,
Mm.
People email me all the time about things like, Kevin, what could I do? I'm like, I don't know. Like, I'm a podcaster.
Mm.
But I know that there are people who are interested in these crafts, and there are people abroad who are interested. And I think that's one of the
Yeah.
themes I keep hearing about time and time again when I'm listening to. Recently, I had an episode of this podcast where I interviewed an American couple who had moved to the Seto Inland Sea on an island, Omishima, and they had bought some old Akia, the abandoned homes, and they've renovated them, and they're kind of getting into agriculture. And that's the one thing that, although they are foreigners, but the fact that this island has all these like empty houses and once were farms, all these empty lots of land everywhere. So they bought these two buildings, but now all these people in the community are like, you're willing to work land here? Here's a plot of land, and here's another plot of land.
Yeah.
And would you like another plot of
Yeah.
land? And people in the local community are just welcoming them with open arms. And it's not like that in
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
communities, but there are communities where they're just,
No.
that the idea of revitalization, they're just happy to see someone come and do this and to see someone
Yes.
working the land. And I think that, if there are, obviously we want Japanese people involved in this so much as well. But I mean, I'm assuming that even if there are those energetic, passionate foreigners who are willing to come and kind of carry on these traditions, it would make people happy.
Yeah. I think so. I currently have a proposal before a city on Shikoku Island, and it's to build them 5 new wooden tourist boats. My understanding is the city fathers are debating whether to go to fiberglass boats or stick with traditional wooden boats. You can just guess where I come down on that. If I get that project, I'd like to really craft it as an educational project. I'd like to bring in apprentices and try to expose, a number of people to the craft. So we'll see. And where that could go from there, I don't know. But it's an uphill battle, but it's fertile ground. That's the other thing. Like you say, there's a lot of enthusiasm, and there is a lot of enthusiasm among young Japanese, and older Japanese, disgruntled salarymen or retired Japanese.
Yeah. Well, even I'm going to admit, like, one of the things I'm not saying I'm going to become a boat builder one day, but maybe, you never know. But like, one of the things that I often talk about, a conversation in my house, I'm an international school teacher. I'm in my late 40s now, which actually means I'm going to age out relatively soon. I've got about another 10 years left of teaching because of visas and this and that, like, this career is finished. And then, I'll be in my late 50s. That's still young, especially in 2024. So what are the next steps for me? Because, again, I've been making my career teaching internationally, but a lot of countries, they won't give out like working visas past 60. So they often say by the time you're 57 or 58, that's your last chance of applying for a contract for a year or two. And then that's it. We're done. Wow. So, there are, like you mentioned, people wanting transitions. And, even like a podcast like this, it's not the biggest show in the world, but there are definitely, when I put out an episode, in the first week, there's 500, 600, 700 people that are downloading it. And then, as time marches on, you just see like the downloads continue and continue and continue. So there's people out there who are probably going to listen to this episode who are probably like, wait a second. This is really interesting, or this is really fascinating. I didn't know about this, or wow, that sounds like something I might be interested in doing, or something similar. So I think, sharing this story is definitely a way to definitely get more people interested, because there are also Japanese people who listen to this podcast as well.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. But yeah, no. So, it's interesting because, I'm again a Canadian, small town in Canada. My population of my hometown is now only 700. When I was growing up there, it was about 1,400. And there's a lot of history has disappeared, unfortunately. And that's something that happens around the world. And I guess it's important for us to talk about it and to get the message out. So I'm curious. I have to mention this. I have to ask a question, because
Okay.
you had a non-disclosure. I was looking at your Instagram. You had mentioned that you had signed an NDA. I know all about those. Before I was a teacher, I used to work in the game development industry. Everything was about NDAs. I was never allowed to talk. I felt like I worked for like the CIA or something when I was working in the game industry. Like I couldn't talk about anything I did unless it was someone who was from my own company. I'm like, what do you do? I work in games. Oh, what are you doing? I work in games. Oh, what are you making? What titles? Yeah, I work in games. Yeah. That was about all I could say. But yeah, so I'm sure the listeners would be very fascinated to hear you worked on the recent the big talk of Japan, or for those who are interested in Japan, Shogun, the FX Disney series. So I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about how you got involved in that and what you were doing as a consultant on that series.
Yeah, so Disney found me. If you Google traditional Japanese boats, I'm kind of 40 out of the first 50. Yeah, I'm kind of the guy. And so Disney contacted me, and they hired me as what they call the Japanese boat consultant.
Okay.
And so what I did was I advised them on the small boats that appear in the series. There's kind of the small samurai rowing boats, and then various fishing boats and other kinds of things. And then I advised them on the Japanese warship that appears in the series. And then the final bit that I did, so that was over a period of months, and I provided boat designs and gave advice. And the boats were actually built by set builders in Vancouver.
Okay.
Though Disney was so desperate, they did ask me, did I know of any traditional Japanese boats that were available in North America? And I said, yeah, there's several of my university-built boats. So I arranged, and Disney purchased 2 boats from Bates College that my students built in my class there. Let's see. Yeah, and then just a couple months before filming began, the Disney brought me out to the set in Vancouver so I could train 30 extras in how to use the Japanese sculling oar.
Okay.
Which quite similar. It's developed from the Chinese yulo, which is a single stern-mounted oar. It was funny because the original concept by Disney was that the boats would be towed on an underwater wire, and the oars would be cut off at the water's surface, and the extras would just wave them back and forth.
Okay.
They just pretend. And when the prop master for the series told me that, I just said, no, you can't. And I said, I think if you just get me out there, I think I can teach them how to do it.
Okay.
And it was a very, very busy week, but I was in a little inflatable chasing, 30 extras, and they did it. And my hat off to them. They were amazing. They worked so hard. We worked long days out on the water all day. And when I said goodbye at the end of the week, I said, hey, it's 2 weeks or 3 weeks till shooting. You guys are paid to show up here every day, regardless.
Mm-hmm.
Take the boats out and practice. Mm-hmm. And it was a lot of fun for me. Of course, watching the series, the only thing I was looking for were the boats.
Yeah.
But it was great. It was just great to see. It was so great to see the boats and great to see, the authentic use of the sculling oars. And so, yeah, that was my contribution.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
I don't want to keep you much longer. It's getting late into the evening where you are, but I'm wondering, like, one of the things I'd sent you a question or kind of a talking point was, and we've kind of already touched on this. A lot of listeners, or some listeners anyway, will be like, "Oh, wow, oh, maybe one day I can go to Japan and do something like this." Or again, there's a lot of other traditions. The one thing that popped into my mind, I recently, and this is a bit depressing for. Let's go back to on the depressing train. But I watched a video on NHK about Koyasan, which is in Wakayama,
Oh yeah.
about Mount Koya, and there was a story about the last hat maker. There's these traditional
Oh wow.
kind of straw
Yeah.
hats that the pilgrims at Koyasan would wear, and this old man, he was really elderly at the time, and he had this kind of like a house on the mountain, and he made these hats, and they were saying he was like the last one. And at this point, he was talking in this story about how he didn't have an apprentice, and and he never had children for whatever reason. He didn't have children, so he didn't have someone to pass this on to. And I remember when that was done, I watched it with my son, who's, he's 14 now, but he was probably 10 at the time. And I was like, oh my God, I'm so sad. Like, I would love to be able to go to Koyasan and say, hey, can I learn from you? But I couldn't do that. But I mean, like, for those out there who are interested, I mean, even just interested in the arts and the traditions and crafts and building things, and who have a passion for Japan, what kind of advice would you give to those people that were maybe what could they do to kind of help, not necessarily boat building, but traditions remain?
Right. Well, I get asked this. I get emails.
I'm sorry. You get asked this all the time.
No. Actually, I get so many of them that I actually composed a blog post a few years ago to sort of answer that question. But actually, it's actually a very good time to try to arrange something like an apprenticeship, and in part, it's because of the desperation of this last generation of craftspeople.
Yeah.
And I could list foreigner after foreigner who has begun to do something similar to what I've done.
Yeah.
And that's, go into a workshop and actually, and I think most Japanese would think, well, this would never happen. They would, like my interpreter said many years ago, this is unthinkable. You, a foreigner, you don't speak Japanese, coming into the workshop. Well, guess what? The craftspeople are desperate, and they will take people. And I'm hearing this story. I'm hearing this story more and more and more. In fact, I'll tell you a personal story. 25 years ago, my wife and I, we lived in Japan for a year, and at one point we leased a van and we drove 8,000 miles around the Japanese coastline, literally looking for boat builders.
Wow.
And I met that, this is in 2003, and I met 42 boat builders. And so we would just go village to village, because it's the only way to find them. There's no association. There's no.
They don't have blogs. They don't have blogs and stuff.
Yeah. They don't have blog. They're not blogging. They don't have websites. And I literally just fishing village to fishing village. And if a village had wooden boats, the odds were there was a boat builder. But anyway, my wife loves Japanese pottery and paper. So as we drove the coastline, she'd be reading the guidebook with the map on her lap, and she'd say, "Hey, wait, turn inland. There's a paper making town." Or turn into the mountains, there's a pottery town. And at one point, we took one of these side trips, and we came across this paper making factory.
Yeah.
We came inside, and it was an elderly man and his wife. And my wife said, "You're my interpreter, and you're going to start. I have a million questions." So we started to talk to this elderly couple, and they were in their 80s. And it was, they were multi-generations running this paper making factory. And the husband pulled me aside. We had been there 15 minutes. And the husband pulled me aside and he said, Your wife is really interested in this. And I said, yeah, she loves washi. She just loves Japanese paper. And he looked at me and he looked at her and he looked back at me and said, tell her she can start Monday. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And I looked at him in amazement, and he said, hey, my wife and I are in our 80s. We have nobody to give this to. We'll give it to her.
Yeah, yeah.
And I've heard other stories like that. I've heard stories of businesses closing and owners actually making it known, we will give it all if someone will just come forward and let us train them. I just last year I had saw an example of that. So anyway, my advice is, find your craft. What is it you're interested in? Do as much research as you can about it. Try to pinpoint it. And then the very best thing you could do is come to Japan, meet the practitioners.
Yeah.
Show up, get to see people face to face. And even if you're Japanese, even if you don't speak Japanese, that's the great irony of what I did.
There's no speaking.
You don't need language because nobody's speaking.
You're observing.
You're observing. That's how you're learning. Language is not necessary, beyond just really just basics. And, and I mean, it is entirely possible and it's happening. Last year, there were 2 American college students. They both had Watson fellowships, which pay for you to spend a year abroad.
Okay.
And they both reached out to me because they wanted to be in Japan and deal with building and woodworking and that sort of thing. And I managed to connect them to craftspeople, both young and old. And those young craftspeople in Japan are much more Western thinking, and much more open, to kind of maybe even connecting to someone via email and making an agreement.
Well, I think that's one of the things that we see. I'm sorry for interrupting. One of the things we see, kind of going back to what we were saying about the kind of you said like the kind of style of like we as Westerners, everything's about how-to books and how-to videos and stuff. And what I'm seeing, for example, if I follow the Eat Local Kobe movement, which is kind of the farm to table movement in Kobe, and some I did work as a kind of volunteer PR ambassador for Kobe when I lived there. And I got connected with this movement, and I see more and more and more young farmers in Japan are putting everything on Instagram. They're like Instagramming their lives. They're and it's. I think that part of that is what's garnering more interest from more young people in Japan to get on the land and work on the land, because it's often like these hip-looking, cool, youngish Japanese people who are like, screw the office job. I'm going to be a farmer. And I'm going to show everyone how amazing this life is. And I mean, I probably follow, because those listening know that I'm interested in agriculture and I run gardening programs and stuff like that at schools, that, I probably follow 50, 60, 70 different farmers young farmers in Japan who are just, their Instagrams are amazing.
Yeah. I was in a rural, severely depopulated fishing village where I built these 6 riverboats last year. And from the time I started in the fall of 2022 till the time I finished in the fall of 2023 or the winter of 2023, easily a dozen young people had moved into that village. And that was a significant number of people, families.
Wow. And
they were farming. And I saw they were my next door neighbors. They were all around me. And in fact, one funny story was on the evening of October 31st, there was a knock at the door, and I opened the door, and the neighboring farmer had his little daughter with him, and she was dressed as a little fairy princess.
Halloween costume, trick-or-treating.
And what he said was, he had explained to her, there's this holiday and the foreigner next door knows what it is. So put on a costume. We'll go up there. We'll get you some candy.
Did you have candy?
I did. I actually had a chocolate bar.
Oh, okay, good.
And so I had this one trick-or-treater come out of the, literally come out of the blue. And then this was so Japanese. It was so Japanese. The little girl didn't know what was going on. You knock on a stranger's door and you get candy,
Yeah.
I could buy into this holiday. And the father was just beside himself. I was in hysterics. I passed over the half-eaten, chocolate bar, and so Japanese. She had a gift for me.
Oh gosh, yeah.
She had
Nice.
prepared a gift for me. So trick or treat in Japan is reciprocal.
Right? Nice, nice.
Anyway,
I give you a
I,
Snickers, you give me a Mars bar.
right. So anyway, but yeah, I think it's a fertile time, and yes, and I think there's a great deal more openness. And what a lot of people ask me, how did you get 9 elderly boat builders to take you on? And I think it happened because I came at just the right time. And I think for each of them, they had reached an age where they understood what was about to be lost.
Mm, yeah.
And I was their last chance.
Mm,
And I've actually met, when I said I've 42 boat builders on my road trip. I mean, I've actually met and interviewed and photographed like 60 odd boat builders. And many of them have said to me, 15 minutes after meeting them, they've said to me, "You have to come back so I can teach you."
wow. Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that has been,
The fact that someone showed interest, right? A legitimate interest.
Right. Yeah. I was the first person to come along and show any interest.
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, if I had had unlimited funding, I could have been a nonstop apprentice for the last 30 years, I mean, but what prevented me was I didn't have the funding to do it, so
Yeah.
anyway, yeah, it's a good time to do this. And young Japanese, like this barrel summit that I want to attend, if I can get the funding.
Yeah.
This barrel summit is young Japanese, a core of which are experienced barrel makers coming up with this new creative solution to passing on the craft. And it's outside of the traditional apprentice system, and it's not really mimicking kind of a Western school format either. It's really, really interesting. So yeah, so there are good things happening, but yeah, but a lot. I mean, and I really wish the Japanese government would do more. You talk about how could I, with a family, cut loose and be an apprentice. And
Yeah.
I just think it's tragic that the Japanese government doesn't fund stipends,
Right.
just doesn't fund living expenses.
Yeah. I mean, like
Or,
even like years ago, I mean, I think of like I'm a Canadian, but like years ago, when I was a young man, before I was a teacher, I worked in the game development industry. And I mean, I'd finished university. I had a 4-year degree, a Bachelor of Arts with like no skill set, and I couldn't get a job doing anything. And I applied for a program called Skills, Loans, and Grants that was around at the time. And they put
Wow.
me, the Canadian government put me, it was if it was like a specific training for like a career track kind of job. I went to a community college and I studied electronic game design and animation for 2 years. The government of Canada paid for my tuition for the 2 years, and they gave me a housing allowance and a stipend,
Wow.
a monthly stipend. And it was all, and they were giving these away like hotcakes at the time because it was like
Yeah.
you are going to go into an industry that at the time was booming, and you're going to directly, as soon as you finish, contribute to the economy. I mean, if Japan only could do things like that, that would be fantastic.
I know. And, and other countries have done, I mean, there's some amazing kind of apprenticeship things and craft support in countries in Europe, and elsewhere. Yeah. So yeah, it's an interesting situation. It's an interesting story, and it's gonna require creative solutions. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, fantastic. Well, Douglas, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm going to share your Instagram, of course, Douglas Brooks Boat Building, and I'm going to share, any other links you sent to me. I'll put them all in the show notes so people can click on them. And
Great.
and I'll also share them on my social media too. So I've got a Facebook page for this podcast. There's about 3,500 people on that Facebook page, and I'll share all the links on there. And everyone listening, you hear that, go follow Douglas on Instagram, of course, and see the things we're talking about. I'll also share photos and of the different types of boats and things on Facebook and Instagram. But yeah.
Do you need a portrait photo of me? I noticed
I would love one of those if you could. Yeah. As you notice the thumbnails, I have I make thumbnail art for each episode, and I have like a portrait of the person. If you have one of those, it'd be great if you could send that along to me. I would appreciate that.
Okay, good.
Often what I do is I hunt one down online, and then I just say, "Hey, is it okay if I use this one?" And then sometimes people are like, "No problem," and other times folks say, No, but I'll send you this one. Yeah.
Okay.
That would be amazing. And again, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I definitely appreciate it.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Well, I want to thank Douglas for coming on the Just Japan podcast. Of course, you can see all the stuff we're talking about over on his website, douglasbrooksboatbuilding.com. You can follow him on Instagram at instagram.com/douglasbrooksboatbuilding or at Douglas Brooks Boatbuilding. I'll put those links in the show notes. I'll also share them over on the Facebook page and on Twitter and in all those different places where I share things regarding the podcast. Also, yeah, so go follow him. Go check out the amazing things he's doing for visuals. I'll be also putting photos up on the Facebook page over at facebook.com/justjapanstuff. Go check that out. Go follow the Facebook page, guys. You're going to miss a lot of things. So, yeah, that's it. And what a fantastic conversation. I really enjoyed that so much. I learned so much from my conversation with Douglas. And there you go, folks. If you are someone who, enjoys working with their hands, creating things, building things, making things, and you have a love of Japan, now's the time, as he says, for heading over there. If you want to learn a Japanese craft, and maybe it is a craft that needs more and more people like you, like me, like everyone listening, to get out there and maintain, now's the time. So you can do some research on that, and yeah, so it's what a cool topic, what an important topic. So I enjoyed, again, my conversation. And again, one more time, I want to thank Douglas Brooks for coming on the podcast. That was great. Go check out all the things he's doing. Go follow his Instagram. Go check out his website. Well, that does it for another episode of the Just Japan podcast. And again, I want to thank each and every one of you who, has taken the time to listen. Without you guys, I wouldn't be making this podcast. And I'm so happy to have you guys out there. This is episode 225. So we're rolling along. All right, guys. Well, remember, you can follow me, Kevin O'Shea, on all the places where I post the podcast. You can follow me on Instagram at jlandkev and at Japan Night Scenes. Links will be in the show notes. Follow the Just Japan podcast Facebook page at Just Japan Stuff. And that's it, guys, for another episode of the podcast. Remember to share this podcast with your family, with your friends, with those who may be interested in things Japan. And leave us a rating and a review. Always appreciated. And that's it. So, folks, wherever you are in the world, I'll be talking to you real soon. And so till next time.